The federal government's going eventually to be raking in a large revenue dividend from the resources boom, as the Howard government did in the years before it left office. But I'd argue that sound economic management principles, in particular the need to avoid repeating a history of blowing the economy up whenever we have a commodities boom through double-digit inflation, means that the government should be saving most of that dividend, and I think they have a moral obligation to save it for future generations as well, given where it's coming from, rather than spending it, and the best way of achieving that is through a sovereign wealth fund. There isn't simply room in the Australian economy to have a resources boom and substantial growth in household or federal government spending at the same time. Victoria's budget is likely to be under some sustained pressure over the next 4 years, in particular as a result of softness in some of its main revenue sources, including the GST, and any revenue that's related to the property market is likely to be much flatter over the next 4 years than it has been over the last 8. If the Victorian government decides to take up the recommendations of its independent review panel, then there will be significant cuts in government spending in prospect. I'm not advocating that they should take up the recommendations of that independent review panel. They may decide that they're politically too different. And I don't get the impression that this government is as motivated to make swinging cuts in government expenditure as the last Liberal government under Kenneth and Stockdale was inclined to do. But nonetheless, this is something that you guys will have to focus on, because it could mean significant problems for your sector going forward. Or it could mean that there are substantial opportunities for the community sector and for not-for-profit agencies to take over responsibilities that government agencies have traditionally performed and do them more effectively, probably with greater respect for the clients that are served, and at lower cost than government agencies have traditionally been capable of doing it. I know from personal involvement that that's almost certainly true of the provision of low-income rental housing, and it may well be true of other things that we've traditionally looked to for government agencies besides. So there are two potential implications flowing for your sector out of these issues facing both the federal and the Victorian budget. It could mean significant cuts in government spending, but it could also mean unprecedented opportunities for the community or not-for-profit sector to take over and deliver more effectively for taxpayers and with greater dignity for clients, the kind of services that we've typically expected government agencies in the past to do. Sorry, Kath, if I went on for a bit longer than had been expected, but I hope that sort of stuff has been useful for you, and if there's time to answer a couple of questions, then I'd be glad to do that before I wind up.
We do have time for a couple of questions, so if people could, if we have some questions, people can just introduce themselves, where they're from, their questions. So do we have the question?
Simon from Small Giants Investments. I was wondering on your take on the economic impacts of the Garner report, and particularly the idea that we should raise tax-free threshold to 25k.
Yeah, well, what Garner suggested is, as I understand it, and I've read the whole report, is to combine putting a price on carbon, which is something that almost all economists support, even though it's controversial in other sectors of the community, putting a price on carbon with the more general case for tax reform, rather than necessarily solely handing over large amounts of cash to people who are identified as being adversely impacted by a carbon price, whether they're low-income individuals or trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries. And I guess Garner's trying to marry the climate change agenda with the Henry review of taxation to do that. As far as I understand it, Garner seems to have significantly underestimated the cost of revenue of raising the tax-free threshold to 25,000, which Henry recommended. Garner estimates, I wouldn't quarrel with this, that a $26 a tonne carbon price would raise $11.5 billion per annum for 30 years. Yet, as I recall, Henry estimated that the cost of raising the tax-free threshold to 25,000 would be at least 30 billion. So those particular sums would appear not to add up. And unless Garner had some other kind of source of revenue to make up the difference in mind, I don't know how you square that together. So.
Any other questions?
As someone who's also got a real interest in the NRS and is really concerned about the stopping of that and also and all the implications of how one lobby effectively to get that reinstated.
Look, I think the sad fact of life is, and please take this in the best intended spirit, that there's no votes in low-income rental housing. Governments assume...
But there are votes in growth.
I agree. I don't dispute that, so maybe that's the case you have to make. But unfortunately, both sides of politics assume that the beneficiaries of anything that's done for low-income rental housing will vote Labor anyway. So, this is the way, unfortunately, political parties think these days, that there's not much to be done with it, whereas despite the fact that the first time notice grant is a massive waste of money, the people who receive it tend to be swinging voters, and governments are prepared to buy their votes. If I were making a case, I'd continue to do it in terms of the fact that shortages of housing are driving up the price of housing, that the shortage of low-income, affordable housing in particular is making it increasingly difficult for people, service workers on relatively low incomes to live in the places where they work. And that's adding to traffic congestion and making it harder to staff those jobs and all that sort of thing. And that a lot of good could be done if we redirected all of the assistance that's given to first-time buyers that ends up in the pockets of second-home vendors, instead to do things that increase the supply of housing. Now, I personally have been saying that for 30 years and had next to zero impact, which probably means there must be a more effective way of making that case, but I haven't found it myself yet.
The review which you referred to that Vertigan and Co are doing, it appears to me that that's something that this sector needs to watch very carefully. How open is its deliberations to us?
They have got an interim report on, it's either on the Treasury website or their own website, but you just Google independent review of state finances and that will take you there. The three guys who are doing it are, they're good guys in a sense. They will listen. I mean, they have their own views about things, but they have certainly had discussions with a lot of people. And if you wanted to engage with them, I think the Secretariat's headed by a Treasury officer called Melissa Skilbeck. And if you want to engage with them, then there will be other opportunities to do that, because they're about to put out a supplement to their interim report, where they're fleshing out the argument they put that the government should target zero net debt, and they will be seeking responses to that. So I would certainly encourage you to think about what that means, think about the arguments for and against it, and to engage with that panel. And as I say, they will come to the view through their own thought processes, but they're reasonable people. Ian Harper in particular, despite being an economist, nonetheless has quite a history of engagement with church organisations and things like that. And he was chair of the Fair Pay Commission, for example, and so forth. So, I mean, he's not a hard head. The other two guys have run state treasuries and run them successfully, I have to say, but they have the kind of approach that you expect the head of the state treasury to have. But neither of them are insensitive people who won't listen to the views of people operating in the coalface. So, yeah, I certainly follow up that report and seek to engage with the three guys that are doing it.
With that, sorry, just on your comment around NRAS, NECU working with the Community Housing Federation of Australia and Power Housing has actually funded some research into the social return on investment for community housing, and I know both Power Housing and Schufer are hoping that work will help provide some further evidence of the benefits of that. But thank you very much, Saul, on behalf of NECU and VCOSS for giving your time, expertise and knowledge this morning. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. So on behalf of NECU and VCOSS, thank you very much.